The midnight fog rolled in thick over the Alaska panhandle, wrapping the narrow channels and fjord waters in a grey shroud that made everything beyond 20 feet disappear into nothingness. Jack Brennan should have turned back an hour ago when the first wisps crept over the mountain ridges, but he'd been chasing the perfect shot, a photograph of the granite cliffs bathed in late summer twilight, and now he was paying for his stubbornness. His 14-foot kayak carved through the cold water, the paddle dipping rhythmically as he squinted ahead, trying to make out the shoreline that had vanished into the murk. The temperature had dropped to the mid-40s, and his breath came out in visible puffs. He'd been kayaking these waters for 7 years, ever since moving to Juneau from Portland to work as a wilderness photographer. But the fog had never been this dense, this suffocating. The current caught him before he realized what was happening, a strong tidal surge that pulled his kayak sideways and drove him toward a cluster of rocks he couldn't see until they were right there, black and slick with kelp. He braced hard, trying to angle away, but the bow struck stone with a hollow crack that sent a jolt through his arms. Water began seeping into the hull through a split in the fiberglass. Within minutes, the kayak was taking on water faster than he could bail, and Jack made the only choice he had. He drove the sinking craft toward a small rocky islet barely visible through the fog, a barren piece of land no bigger than half a football field, covered in boulders and sparse vegetation. Before we continue, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Now, back to Jack's story. He dragged himself onto the rocks, soaked to the bone, his kayak half submerged and useless behind him. His hands were already going numb as he pulled his dry bag onto the islet, taking inventory of what he had. A tent that was miraculously still dry, a sleeping bag, 3 energy bars, a water filter, matches in a waterproof container, a signal whistle, and his camera gear. No satellite phone. He'd left it charging back at the cabin. No flares, no radio. Just him, this godforsaken rock, and fog so thick he couldn't see the mainland shore that he knew was somewhere out there, maybe 2 miles away, maybe less. The first night was the worst. Jack set up his tent in a depression between 2 large boulders that offered some protection from the wind that picked up after midnight, howling through the channels with a sound like distant wolves. He stripped off his wet clothes and climbed into the sleeping bag, shivering so hard his teeth rattled, wondering if hypothermia would take him before morning came. The fog pressed in from all sides, and he could hear water lapping against the rocks, a sound that would normally be soothing, but now felt like a taunt, so close to the mainland, yet impossibly far. When grey dawn finally broke, the fog remained, and Jack emerged from the tent with stiff legs and a gnawing hunger that the single energy bar he allowed himself did nothing to satisfy. He walked the perimeter of the islet, counting his steps, 326 paces around the entire thing, including the areas where he had to climb over boulders. No fresh water source, no shelter beyond what he'd brought. Just rock, kelp-covered tide pools, and the endless grey void beyond. But there were mussels, hundreds of them clinging to the rocks in the intertidal zone, their blue-black shells clustered in crevices where the tide protected them, and kelp, long brown ribbons of it that draped across the stones like abandoned ropes. Jack had foraged before, on easier trips along calmer coastlines, and he knew that mussels could be food if he was careful. He pulled on his gloves and began twisting them free from their byssal threads, the beards that anchored them to the rock, collecting them in his cooking pot until he had several pounds. He knew the risks: toxins, algal blooms, contamination, but he also knew that starvation was a certainty if he didn't eat, and possible poisoning was a risk he'd have to take. He gathered dry kelp from above the tide line and the driest driftwood he could find, building a small fire in a protected spot and boiling the mussels in filtered seawater until they opened. The meat was tough and briny, but it was food, and he ate slowly, rationing what he'd cooked, saving half for later. By day 3, the fog still hadn't lifted, and Jack realized with growing dread that no one would be looking for him yet. He wasn't expected back in Juneau until the end of the week, and he'd told his friend Dylan he was doing a solo camping trip, deliberately vague about his route. The Coast Guard wouldn't start searching until someone reported him missing, and that was at least 4 more days away. He began collecting wood obsessively, scavenging every piece of driftwood along the tide line, stacking it in a pile near the highest point of the islet. Most of it was damp, some of it waterlogged, but if a boat came close enough, if the fog cleared even slightly, he needed to be ready to signal. The isolation pressed on him like a physical weight. Jack had always enjoyed solitude. It was why he'd chosen this career, this life. But being alone by choice was different from being trapped. He tried to keep his mind occupied, reviewing everything he knew about survival, about the waters around him. The channels here were traveled by fishing boats and occasional tour vessels, but in late August, after the peak season, traffic was sparse. The storms got worse as autumn approached, and the chances of being stranded for longer periods increased exponentially. He couldn't let himself think about that. Not yet. On the 5th day, the fog finally thinned enough for him to see across the water to the mainland, a dark smudge of forested mountains that looked impossibly far away. Jack climbed to the highest point of the islet and blew his signal whistle in 3 sharp blasts, the universal distress signal, repeating it every 10 minutes until his lips were numb and his lungs ached. No response came. No boats appeared on the horizon. He spent the afternoon gathering more mussels, more kelp, forcing himself to eat, even though his stomach had started to rebel against the monotonous diet. He rationed his energy bars down to a few bites per day, saving them for when the hunger became unbearable. The rain started that night, a cold drizzle that soaked everything and made keeping a fire going nearly impossible. Jack huddled in his tent, listening to the drops patter against the nylon, feeling the chill seep into his bones. His fingers had started to crack from the constant exposure to salt water, and he'd developed sores on his feet from the damp socks he couldn't get fully dry. He thought about his sister Claire back in Oregon, about how she'd always worried about his lifestyle, his need to push into remote places alone. He thought about the last conversation they'd had 3 weeks ago, when she'd asked him why he couldn't just settle down, find something safer. He'd laughed it off, told her he was careful, that he knew what he was doing. The memory stung now. By day 7, Jack had developed a routine that kept him sane. Wake at dawn, collect mussels during low tide, boil them for breakfast, gather firewood, build and maintain a signal fire on the islet's highest point, blow the whistle at regular intervals, eat again in the evening, sleep. He kept the fire going continuously now, feeding it damp wood that produced thick plumes of smoke during the day and a flame bright enough to be seen at night if anyone was out there looking. He'd stripped apart some of the kelp and laid it out to dry, experimenting with eating it raw and cooked, finding that the fresher pieces had a mineral taste that wasn't entirely unpleasant. His body was adjusting to the diet, but he'd lost weight, his face gaunt when he caught his reflection in a tide pool. The weather turned rougher around day 10, with winds that made the tent stakes pull loose and waves that crashed higher on the rocks, limiting his foraging time to narrow windows when the tide was right. Jack reinforced the tent with stones and moved his firewood pile to a more protected spot, covering it with his rain gear to keep it as dry as possible. The isolation was starting to play tricks on his mind. He found himself talking out loud, narrating his actions like he was recording a video, explaining his survival techniques to an imaginary audience. It helped, gave him something to focus on besides the gnawing fear that no one was coming, that he'd made a mistake that would cost him everything. On day 12, a fishing boat passed within what looked like half a mile of the islet, close enough that Jack could see its white hull and green trim through breaks in the fog. He ran to his signal fire, threw on every piece of green vegetation he'd collected, and created a smoke column that rose thick and black into the grey sky. He blew his whistle until he thought his lungs would burst, waved his orange rain jacket over his head, screamed himself hoarse. The boat kept going, its engine sound fading into the distance until there was nothing but the wind and waves again. Jack sank to his knees on the rocks, the jacket falling from his hands, and for the first time since he'd landed on this god-forsaken piece of stone, he let himself cry, not from despair, not entirely, but from the crushing realization of how small he was, how insignificant against the vast indifference of the sea and sky. He allowed himself 10 minutes of weakness, then stood up and got back to work. Crying wouldn't save him, action would. The second week blurred together in a haze of cold, hunger, and repetitive tasks. Jack's energy bars were gone. His entire diet now consisted of mussels, kelp, and the occasional small crab he managed to catch in the tide pools. He boiled everything, filtering the water multiple times, terrified of getting sick out here, where illness would be a death sentence. His hands were raw and bleeding from constantly working with salt water and rough shells. The sores on his feet had worsened despite his best efforts to keep them dry. At night, he lay in his sleeping bag and mentally walked through the streets of Portland where he'd grown up, remembering coffee shops and bookstores and the warm comfort of ordinary life. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now. Day 16 brought the first break in the weather, a stretch of clearer sky that lasted almost 6 hours, enough time for Jack to see boats in the distance, several of them, but all too far away to notice his signals. He kept his fire burning, kept making smoke, kept blowing the whistle even though his faith in rescue was wearing thin. That night he calculated his timeline. It had been 16 days since he'd been stranded. Dylan would have reported him missing by now. He was sure of that. The Coast Guard would be searching, but these waters were vast, thousands of square miles of channels, islands, and fjords. Finding one man on one small islet was like finding a needle in a haystack the size of a small state. The thought that kept him going was the knowledge that he'd filed a general float plan with the harbour master in Juneau before he left, indicating he'd be kayaking the Fjord region. It wasn't specific, but it narrowed the search area. They'd find his truck at the put-in point. They'd start there and work outward. He just had to stay alive long enough for the search grid to reach this far out. On day 18, Jack woke to the sound of a helicopter in the distance, the distinctive thump, thump, thump of rotors cutting through the morning air. He exploded out of the tent, grabbing his orange rain jacket and his signal mirror, a piece of reflective emergency gear he'd almost forgotten he had, and ran to the highest point. The helicopter was maybe 2 miles away, following the coastline, and Jack angled the mirror to catch the thin sunlight that had just broken through the clouds. He flashed it toward the aircraft in deliberate bursts, 3 flashes, pause, 3 flashes, pause. The standard distress signal. His hands shook so badly he could barely hold the mirror steady. The helicopter continued its search pattern, moving parallel to the shore, and Jack's heart hammered so hard he thought it might break through his ribs. He kept flashing the mirror, kept waving the jacket, kept shouting even though there was no way they could hear him over the engine noise. The aircraft banked slightly, seemed to hover, then turned in his direction. Jack's legs went weak. They'd seen him. After 18 days of isolation, cold, hunger, and fear, someone had finally seen him. The Coast Guard helicopter circled the islet once, confirming what they'd spotted, then moved to a hover position about 100 feet up. The rotor wash flattened Jack's tent and scattered his carefully stacked firewood, but he didn't care. He stood in the middle of the islet, arms raised, tears streaming down his face. A rescue swimmer descended on a cable, touched down on the rocks, and made his way over with practiced efficiency. The man was maybe 30, compact and professional, wearing an orange dry suit and carrying rescue equipment. "Jack Brennan!" the swimmer shouted over the helicopter noise. Jack nodded, unable to speak. "Are you injured? Can you walk?" "I can walk," Jack managed, his voice rough from disuse and exposure. "Been here 18 days. The swimmer did a quick medical assessment, checking Jack's vitals, examining the sores and cuts, assessing him for hypothermia and dehydration. "You're in rough shape, but you're alive. That's what matters. We're going to get you out of here. Can you handle the hoist?" Jack nodded again. The swimmer fitted him with a harness, gave him clear instructions, and signaled to the helicopter crew. Within minutes, Jack was rising off the islet, the rocks and tide pools falling away beneath him as the cable pulled him up toward the open door of the aircraft. Strong hands grabbed him, pulled him inside, wrapped him in thermal blankets. The noise was overwhelming, the warmth almost painful after so many days of cold, but it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever experienced. The flight back to Juneau took 30 minutes. Jack sat wrapped in blankets, an IV in his arm for dehydration, while the rescue crew worked around him with efficient compassion. One of them, a woman with kind eyes and grey-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun, squeezed his shoulder. "You did good out there. Most people wouldn't have lasted this long." "Oh, the Mussels," Jack croaked, "and Kelp kept a signal fire going when I could." "Smart," she said, "very smart. We've been searching for 6 days, ever since your friend reported you overdue. Covered a lot of territory. You picked a hell of a place to get stranded." Jack closed his eyes, letting the vibration of the helicopter and the warmth of the blankets seep into his bones. 6 days of searching. That meant they'd started on day 13, just like he'd calculated. He'd held on long enough. Barely, but enough. They landed at the hospital in Juneau, where a medical team was waiting. Jack was transferred to a gurney and wheeled inside, the fluorescent lights harsh after so many days of grey fog and dim daylight. The doctors were thorough, checking him for hypothermia, infection, malnutrition, and the effects of prolonged exposure. His core temperature was low, but not dangerously so. The sores on his hands and feet would need treatment and antibiotics. He'd lost 14 pounds from a frame that hadn't been carrying much extra weight to begin with, but he was alive, functional, and according to the lead physician, a stern-faced man named Dr. Patel, who'd seen his share of wilderness rescues, remarkably intact considering what he'd endured. Dylan showed up an hour later, bursting into the hospital room with red-rimmed eyes and a relief so palpable it filled the space between them. "Jesus Christ, Jack, I thought you were dead. When you didn't check in, when they found your truck and the broken kayak wasn't with you." His voice broke. "Everyone was saying the currents, the cold water, that you probably—" "I'm okay," Jack said. And it was true, more or less. "Got lucky. Found that islet before the kayak went under completely." Dylan pulled a chair close to the bed, sat down hard like his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. "The Coast Guard said you survived 3 weeks on mussels and seaweed, that you kept a signal fire burning on wet wood. How did you even do that?" Jack shrugged, wincing at the soreness in his shoulders. "Didn't have much choice. Either figure it out or die. I chose to figure it out." "Your sister called me every day," Dylan said. "She's flying up from Portland tomorrow. She's going to lose her mind when she sees you." Jack smiled despite the exhaustion pulling at him. "She's going to say I told you so. For the rest of my life, she's going to remind me about this." "Yeah," Dylan agreed. "She probably will." The story broke in the local news that evening. Photographer survives. 21 days stranded on remote islet, and by the next morning, it had spread to regional outlets and then national ones. Jack became an unexpected sensation, the man who'd lived on mussels and kelp, who'd built signal fires from damp driftwood, who'd kept himself alive through knowledge, determination, and sheer stubborn refusal to give up. Reporters wanted interviews. Survival experts analyzed his techniques. His social media accounts exploded with messages from strangers offering congratulations, sharing their own close calls, thanking him for being an inspiration. Jack found it all surreal and slightly overwhelming. He wasn't a hero. He'd made a stupid mistake by going out in deteriorating weather without proper communication equipment. He'd gotten lucky with the Islet, lucky with the Mussels, lucky that the toxins hadn't killed him, lucky that the Coast Guard had found him when they did. But people didn't want to hear about luck. They wanted to hear about perseverance, about the human will to survive. So he gave them that, because in the end, it was true too. He had persevered. He had refused to surrender to the fog and cold and isolation. Claire arrived the next day, and the moment she walked into his hospital room, she burst into tears and hugged him so hard his ribs protested. "You idiot," she sobbed against his shoulder. "You absolute idiot." "I know," Jack said, holding her with arms that still felt weak. "I know. You could have died out there, alone. We wouldn't have even known what happened to you. But I didn't die. I'm here." She pulled back, looking at him with eyes that were identical to his own, the same grey-green their mother had passed down to both of them. "You scared me. You scared everyone." "I scared myself," Jack admitted. "I thought I was dead a dozen times, thought I'd never see you again, never get to tell you that you were right about me being reckless." Claire laughed through her tears, a wet, messy sound. "Of course I was right. I'm always right. You just never listen." He stayed in the hospital for 3 days while the doctors monitored his recovery and the antibiotics cleared up the infections in his hands and feet. The physical healing was the easy part. The mental aftermath took longer. Jack found himself waking in the middle of the night, disoriented, reaching for the tent walls that weren't there. He'd hear the sound of waves in his dreams and snap awake, heart racing, convinced he was back on the islet. The psychologist the hospital assigned him said it was normal, that he'd experienced trauma and his brain needed time to process it. When they finally discharged him, Dylan drove him back to his cabin on the outskirts of Juneau, a small place overlooking the water that had always felt like sanctuary. Now, looking at the channel beyond his windows, Jack felt a complicated mix of emotions. Respect, wariness, a strange kind of intimacy with the landscape that had nearly killed him. He'd spent 7 years exploring these waters, learning their rhythms and moods, and in 21 days on a barren rock, they'd taught him lessons he'd carry for the rest of his life. The kayak was a total loss, recovered by the Coast Guard, but too damaged to repair. Jack ordered a new one, but it sat unused in his garage for weeks while he wrestled with whether he'd ever have the nerve to paddle out into the channels again. Claire called twice a week from Portland, checking on him, making sure he was okay, gently suggesting that maybe he should consider a different career, something safer, something that didn't involve solo trips into remote wilderness. But Jack couldn't do that. Photography, wilderness exploration, it was woven into who he was. The mistake hadn't been going out alone. The mistake had been going out unprepared, without proper communication equipment, without respect for how quickly conditions could change. He could fix that. He could learn from it. He could honor the fact that he'd been given a second chance by being smarter, more cautious, more prepared next time. 6 weeks after his rescue, Jack loaded his new kayak with gear, triple-checked his satellite phone and emergency beacon, filed a detailed float plan with the Coast Guard, and paddled out into the channels on a clear October morning. Dylan went with him this time, a concession to caution that Jack no longer resented. The water was calm, the sky that particular shade of sharp blue that only came in autumn, and as his paddle cut through the surface, Jack felt something settle inside him. Not the reckless confidence of before, but a deeper, earned understanding of his own limits and the power of the wilderness he loved. They paddled for 3 hours, staying close to shore, never straying more than a mile from safe landing points. At one point, they passed a small rocky islet covered in barnacles and tide pools, and Jack paused, resting his paddle across the kayak, looking at it. It wasn't the same one he'd been stranded on, but it could have been. They all looked similar from the water, unremarkable, barren, easy to overlook, unless it saved your life. Then it became the most important piece of land in the world. "You okay?" Dylan called from his kayak a few yards away. "Yeah," Jack said, and meant it. "I'm good." They made it back to the put-in point as the sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink that would have made an incredible photograph. Jack didn't reach for his camera. Some moments were meant to be experienced, not captured. He pulled his kayak onto the beach, secured it to the truck, and stood for a moment watching the water lap against the shore, feeling gratitude and humility in equal measure. The story of his survival became part of local legend, told in kayaking circles and survival training courses as an example of both what to do and what not to do. Jack gave a few talks, shared his experiences with search and rescue organizations, and tried to use his unexpected platform to emphasize preparation and respect for wilderness environments. He never quite got used to being called a survivor or a hero, but he accepted that the experience had changed him in ways both visible and hidden. Years later, Jack would look back on those 21 days as the crucible that defined the rest of his life. Not because he'd conquered the wilderness or proven something about human endurance, but because he'd learned what it meant to be truly alone and to fight for survival with nothing but knowledge, determination, and a stubborn refusal to quit. He'd learned that the line between life and death could be as thin as the shell of a mussel or as substantial as a well-maintained signal fire. He'd learned that preparation mattered, that mistakes had consequences, and that sometimes the greatest strength was simply the willingness to keep going when every rational thought said to give up. The Islet remained out there in the channels, unchanged by his ordeal, a small piece of rock that would shelter others or claim them, depending on preparation, luck, and will. Jack never tried to find it again. He didn't need to. It had already given him everything it had to teach, and he'd carried those lessons back to the world of warmth, light, and second chances. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.